She dusted the corners, polished the glass, and kept her eyes down. No one knew her name. To them, she was just the maid. So when she sat, just for a moment, on the edge of the sofa, it was like a crime. The glares came fast. "Get up. That's not for you," someone barked. Their voices rose. "Who gave you permission? Do you think you belong here?" She lowered her gaze, quietly stood, and whispered an apology. But inside, something else stirred. Because she knew what they didn't. Someone was coming. And he wasn't just anyone. The front door opened. Silence fell. In walked a man in a sharp suit, confident, powerful, eye scanning the room. The billionaire. Their moods shifted. Suddenly, everyone stood straighter. But then, he walked past them all and stopped right in front of her. He took her hand gently, looked around, and said one word. "Wife." The room froze. Gasps echoed. Not maid. Not servant. Wife. In that moment, status shattered, faces turned pale, and the real power in the room was finally clear. Welcome to Heroes Unheard. Before we continue this emotional story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being a part of it. The Madison estate sprawled across 15 acres of perfectly manicured lawns and gardens that cost more to maintain each month than most people earned in a year. The main house stood like a monument to wealth, its marble columns and floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting the morning sun in ways that seemed almost calculated to intimidate visitors. Inside, every surface gleamed with the kind of polish that came from constant attention, and every piece of furniture had been chosen not for comfort but for its ability to announce the owner's status to anyone who entered. Maria Santos had been working in houses like this for 12 years, but the Madison estate was different. Not because it was grander than the others, though it certainly was, but because of the way the family treated the help. Where other wealthy families maintained a polite distance, the Madisons seemed to take pleasure in reminding everyone exactly where they stood in the hierarchy. The weekly staff meetings weren't just about schedules and duties. They were opportunities for Mrs. Madison to establish dominance, to make sure everyone understood their place. She was a woman who had married into money and never let anyone forget it. Every morning, she would sweep through the house in silk robes that cost more than Maria's monthly salary, pointing out dust that didn't exist and flaws that only she could see. Her daughter Jessica had inherited the same attitude but with less subtlety. At 22, she moved through the house like she owned not just the property, but the people who worked there. Maria had learned to navigate their moods and demands with the quiet efficiency that kept her employed. She arrived each morning at 6, worked until 8 in the evening, and went home to her small apartment with barely enough energy to call her sister in El Salvador. The pay was good by industry standards, but every dollar came with a cost to her dignity that she absorbed in silence. The other staff members had learned the same survival strategy. There was Roberto, the groundskeeper who kept his eyes down and his responses to single syllables. Carmen, the cook, who had mastered the art of becoming invisible while preparing elaborate meals that the family barely touched. And Sarah, the younger housekeeper who was still learning that fighting back only made things worse. What none of them knew was that everything they thought they understood about the Madison family was built on a lie. A lie so complete that even the family members themselves had started to believe it. The Real story lived in documents locked in a safe that Mrs. Madison checked obsessively every night, in phone calls that happened behind closed doors, and in a marriage that existed on paper but had died years ago in ways that mattered most. The morning that would change everything started like any other. Maria arrived as the sun was just clearing the tree line, her footsteps silent on the marble floors as she began her routine. The family was still asleep, which meant she had 2 precious hours to work without constant supervision and criticism. She moved through the downstairs rooms with practiced efficiency, dusting surfaces that didn't need dusting and straightening cushions that were already perfectly aligned. It was just past 8 when Jessica Madison came downstairs, her designer pajamas somehow managing to look both casual and expensive. She moved through the kitchen without acknowledging Carmen, who was preparing fresh fruit that would likely go uneaten, and wandered into the living room where Maria was finishing the morning cleaning routine. "Why are these pillows crooked?" Jessica asked, though they weren't. It was a game she liked to play, finding fault where none existed just to watch the staff scramble to fix imaginary problems. Maria straightened the pillows again, keeping her voice steady. "I'm sorry, Miss Jessica. I'll be more careful." But Jessica wasn't finished. She had woken up in a bad mood, probably because her credit card had been declined at a boutique the previous day, and she needed someone to absorb her frustration. And why does this room smell like cleaning products? I've told you before, we have guests coming. The house shouldn't smell like chemicals. The irony wasn't lost on Maria. The same people who demanded the house be spotlessly clean complained when it smelled like cleaning supplies. But she nodded and opened the windows, letting in the morning air that carried the scent of Roberto's carefully maintained gardens. That's when Mrs. Madison appeared at the top of the grand staircase, already dressed for a day of shopping and social obligations. She surveyed the scene below like a general inspecting troops, her eyes searching for any excuse to assert her authority. "Maria," she called down, her voice echoing off the marble walls. "When you're finished down there, I need you to reorganize my closet. Everything is completely wrong." Maria knew the closet had been organized perfectly just 2 days earlier, but she nodded. "Of course, Mrs. Madison." The morning continued with a steady stream of impossible demands and manufactured complaints. The breakfast wasn't warm enough, though it had just come off the stove. The newspaper was folded incorrectly. The flowers in the entryway were too bright and needed to be replaced with something more subtle. Each criticism was delivered with the casual cruelty of people who had never learned to see the help as fully human. By noon, Maria's feet ached and her back was sore from constantly bending to clean surfaces that were already clean. She had eaten nothing since the small breakfast she'd prepared for herself at home, and her head was beginning to throb from the combination of hunger and stress. When she finished reorganizing Mrs. Madison's enormous closet for the second time that week, she allowed herself a moment of rest. The living room was empty, the family having dispersed to various activities that didn't involve thinking about the people who made their comfortable lives possible. Maria sank onto the edge of the white leather sofa, not to relax but simply to ease the pressure on her feet for 30 seconds. She kept her eyes on the doorway, ready to spring up the moment she heard footsteps. But 30 seconds was too long. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Jessica's voice cut through the quiet like a blade, sharp with an anger that seemed disproportionate to the situation. Maria shot to her feet immediately, her heart racing. "I'm sorry, I was just—" "You were just what?" "Making yourself comfortable on furniture that costs more than you make in 6 months. Jessica moved closer, her voice rising. "Do you have any idea how disgusting that is? Sitting where we sit with your dirty uniform." The uniform wasn't dirty. Maria changed into fresh clothes every morning and maintained them with the same care she brought to everything else in the house. But facts didn't matter when Jessica was in this mood. Mrs. Madison appeared in the doorway as if summoned by the sound of conflict. She took in the scene with the practiced eye of someone who enjoyed these moments of absolute power. "What's going on here?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew and approved. "I found her sitting on our sofa," Jessica said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Like she belongs here. Like she's one of us." Mrs. Madison's expression hardened into something cold and calculating. "Is that true, Maria? Were you using our furniture like you own it?" The question hung in the air like a trap. Maria could feel the weight of their stares, the way they were savoring her discomfort. These were women who had never worked a day in their lives, who had never felt the ache of standing for 12 hours straight or the hunger that came from being too busy serving others to feed themselves. "I was resting for just a moment," Maria said quietly. "My feet were hurting." "Your feet were hurting?" Mrs. Madison repeated the words like they were foreign to her. "Well, perhaps if you're too delicate for this work, you should find something more suitable to your constitution." It was a threat disguised as concern, and everyone in the room understood it. Maria's job hung in the balance, dependent on her willingness to accept humiliation without fighting back. But Jessica wasn't satisfied with the implicit threat. She wanted to push further, to see how much damage she could do with words. "Maybe she thinks because she's been here for 2 years, she's part of the family," Jessica said with a laugh that had no warmth in it. "Maybe she's forgotten that she's just the help." The words hit like physical blows, designed to strip away dignity and reduce a human being to nothing more than a function. Maria felt her cheeks burn with shame and anger, but she held her tongue. She needed this job. She had responsibilities, people depending on her, bills that wouldn't pay themselves. "I apologize," she said, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "It won't happen again." But even her apology wasn't enough. Mrs. Madison wanted to make sure the lesson was complete, that Maria understood exactly where she stood in their world. "No, it won't," she said with cold finality. "Because if it does, you'll be looking for work somewhere else. And I can guarantee that when I'm finished describing your attitude and behavior to my friends, you won't find it easy to get another position in this city." The threat was clear and devastating. In their world, reputation was everything, and a bad reference from the Madison family could destroy a career in domestic service. Maria nodded, swallowing her pride along with her anger. That's when they heard the sound of a car in the driveway. Not just any car, but the deep, expensive purr of an engine that cost more than most houses. Mrs. Madison glanced toward the window, and for just a moment, her composure cracked. Her face went pale, and her hands began to shake almost imperceptibly. "He's early," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. Jessica looked confused. "Who's early? Daddy's not supposed to be back until—" "Go to your room," Mrs. Madison said sharply, cutting her daughter off mid-sentence. "Now." But Jessica was curious now, drawn by her mother's obvious distress. "Who is that? Why are you acting so weird?" Outside, car doors slammed with the solid weight of German engineering, and footsteps approached the front door with the confident stride of someone who belonged everywhere he went. Mrs. Madison's face had gone from pale to ashen, and her voice came out in a harsh whisper. "I said go to your room." But it was too late. The front door opened without a knock, without hesitation, with the authority of someone who didn't need permission to enter. And in that moment, everything they thought they knew about power and hierarchy was about to be turned upside down. The man who walked through the door commanded attention without saying a word. He was tall, probably in his early 50s, with the kind of presence that came from years of making decisions that affected thousands of lives. His suit was perfectly tailored but understated, the kind of expensive that whispered rather than shouted. But it wasn't his clothes that made him imposing. It was the way he moved through space like he owned it, the way his eyes took in everything with the calculating precision of someone accustomed to seeing what others missed. Mrs. Madison tried to compose herself, but her voice came out strained and artificial. "Richard, you're early. We weren't expecting a—" He held up a hand, silencing her with a gesture that was both gentle and absolute. His eyes moved around the room, taking in the scene that had been playing out just moments before. They lingered on Maria, who was still standing frozen near the sofa, her face flushed with embarrassment and residual anger. "I can see that," he said quietly, and there was something in his tone that made Mrs. Madison take a step backward. Jessica, still confused by the sudden shift in atmosphere, stepped forward with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for her behavior. "Daddy's friend, right?" she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Jessica. I don't think we've met." The man looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "No," he said simply. "We haven't." Mrs. Madison was trying to regain control of the situation, but her voice had taken on a desperate quality that everyone in the room could hear. "Richard, perhaps we should talk privately. There's been a small misunderstanding with the staff, but—" "A misunderstanding?" He turned his attention back to Maria, and when he spoke, his voice carried a warmth that hadn't been there before. "Are you all right?" The question was directed to Maria, but it was Mrs. Madison who tried to answer. "She's fine. She was just—" "I was asking her," Richard said, his voice still quiet but with an edge that cut through the room like a blade. Maria looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time. There was something familiar about his face, something that tugged at the edges of her memory. But before she could place it, Mrs. Madison was talking again, her words tumbling over each other in her haste to explain. She was sitting on the furniture. "The help isn't supposed to be." "The help." Richard repeated the phrase like it was something distasteful. He looked around the room again, taking in the expensive art, the marble floors, the crystal chandelier that caught the afternoon light and threw rainbows across the walls. "Yes, well, you know how it is," Mrs. Madison said with a nervous laugh. "You have to maintain certain boundaries, or they start to get ideas above their station." The silence that followed was so complete that Maria could hear her own heartbeat. Richard stood perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back, his face a mask of controlled emotion. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low that everyone had to strain to hear it. "Ideas above their station," he repeated slowly, as if testing how the words tasted. "And what station would that be, exactly?" Mrs. Madison seemed to sense that she was walking into dangerous territory, but she was too far in to back down now. "Well, she's the maid. She cleans, she takes orders, she does what she's told. That's how these arrangements work." "These arrangements," Richard said, and now there was no mistaking the ice in his voice. "I see." He walked further into the room, his footsteps silent on the marble floor. Jessica watched him with growing uneasiness, finally beginning to sense that something was very wrong with this picture. "And you feel comfortable treating her this way?" Richard asked, still speaking quietly. "Making her feel small? Humiliating her for taking a moment's rest?" "I don't see what business it is of yours," Mrs. Madison said, trying to reclaim some authority. "This is my house, and I'll run it as I see fit." Richard stopped walking. He turned to look at her with an expression that was almost pitying. Your house, he said. Yes, about that. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather portfolio, the kind that lawyers and executives used for important documents. Mrs. Madison's face went completely white. Richard, please, not here. Not in front of... In front of whom? Richard asked. In front of my wife? The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread outward and changed everything they touched. Jessica's mouth fell open. Mrs. Madison swayed slightly, as if she might faint. And Maria felt the world tilt around her as memories came flooding back. The wedding had been small and private, held in a judge's chambers with only 2 witnesses present. She had worn a simple white dress that she'd bought at a department store, and he had worn a dark suit that made his eyes look even more intense than usual. They had known each other for 6 months, a whirlwind romance that had surprised them both with its intensity. But then his business had exploded, taking him around the world for months at a time. The marriage had become something they maintained through phone calls and brief visits, a connection that was real but distant. When the business troubles started, when he needed to disappear for a while to handle legal complications, they had agreed that she would live quietly under her maiden name while he sorted things out. That had been 3 years ago. Mrs. Madison had introduced herself as Richard's business partner, someone who was helping him manage his affairs while he was out of the country. She had offered Maria a job-keeping house for the family, never mentioning that the family name was false, that the mansion belonged to Richard, that the woman playing Lady of the Manor was nothing more than a caretaker with delusions of grandeur. Maria, Richard said, and his voice was gentle now, filled with warmth and regret. I'm so sorry. She looked up at him, and suddenly she could see past the expensive suit and the businessman's demeanor to the man who had made her laugh during long walks on the beach, who had held her close during thunderstorms, who had promised to love her through whatever complications life might bring. You're supposed to be in Switzerland, she said quietly. The business is finished, he replied. All the legal problems are resolved. I came back to get you. Mrs. Madison made a sound like a wounded animal. You can't be serious. She's nobody. Richard turned to look at her with an expression of such cold fury that she took several steps backward. She is my wife, he said, and each word was delivered with the precision of a hammer blow. She is the woman I love, and she is the legal owner of half of everything you see in this room. The portfolio in his hands contained not just marriage certificates but property deeds, financial documents, and legal papers that painted a very different picture of power and ownership than what Mrs. Madison had been presenting to the world. The house is in both our names, Richard continued, his voice growing stronger. The bank accounts, the investments, the cars in the driveway. Everything you've been treating as your personal kingdom belongs to her as much as it belongs to me. Jessica was staring at Maria as if seeing her for the first time. She's your wife? But she's what? Richard asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Jessica opened her mouth, but no words came out. How do you finish that sentence without revealing the prejudice and entitlement that had been driving your behavior all along? Mrs. Madison was backing toward the door, her face a mask of panic and rage. This is impossible. You can't just change everything like this. I'm not changing anything, Richard said calmly. I'm revealing what was always true. You were hired to maintain this property while I was away. You were given a place to live and a generous salary in exchange for taking care of my home. At no point were you given permission to abuse my wife. The word wife seemed to echo in the vast room, transforming everything it touched. The marble floors that had seemed so intimidating suddenly felt like home. The expensive furniture that had been forbidden territory was revealed as Maria's by right. The crystal chandelier that had reflected their cruelty now cast warm light on a truth that had been hidden too long. Richard walked over to Maria and extended his hand. She took it, feeling the familiar strength of his fingers, the warmth that had sustained her through 3 years of separation and humiliation. I should have come back sooner, he said quietly. I should never have let this happen. Maria shook her head. You were protecting us both. I understood. But Richard's attention had turned back to the 2 women who were still standing frozen in the middle of the room. Mrs. Madison was clutching her purse like a shield, her face cycling through anger, fear, and desperate calculation. Jessica was staring at Maria with a mixture of shock and something that might have been the beginning of shame. You have until tonight to pack your things and leave, Richard said, his voice businesslike now. I'll have your final paychecks ready within the hour, along with excellent references that make no mention of how you've behaved today. You can't just throw us out, Mrs. Madison said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I can, and I am," Richard replied. "But I'm doing it with more kindness than you showed my wife when you thought she was powerless." The house felt different with Mrs. Madison and Jessica gone. The marble floors still gleamed, but now they reflected warmth instead of cold intimidation. The expensive furniture remained exactly where it had always been, but it no longer felt forbidden or foreign. Most importantly, the atmosphere of fear and humiliation that had permeated every room was gone, replaced by something that felt like home. Maria walked through the rooms she had cleaned for 2 years, seeing them now through completely different eyes. The master bedroom that she had dusted and organized every day was hers to sleep in. The kitchen where she had prepared meals for people who barely acknowledged her existence was hers to cook in. The living room where she had been humiliated for taking a moment's rest was hers to relax in whenever she chose. Richard had spent the afternoon on phone calls, arranging for Mrs. Madison's departure and handling the business details that would officially restore Maria's identity and rights. But as evening approached, they found themselves alone together for the first time in 3 years, standing in the garden that Roberto still maintained with careful attention. "I kept thinking about this place," Richard said, his arm around Maria's shoulders as they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. "When I was in meetings in Geneva or staying in hotels in London, I would think about coming home to you in this garden." Maria leaned against him, feeling the solid reality of his presence after so many months of phone calls and brief messages. "I used to stand here when I was working," she said quietly, "looking at these flowers that I wasn't supposed to touch, in this garden I wasn't supposed to enjoy. I never imagined it was actually mine." "It was always yours," Richard said. "Everything here was always yours. I just wish I could have spared you those 2 years of treatment that no one should have to endure." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the automatic sprinkler system begin its evening cycle, sending arcs of water across the perfectly maintained lawn. In the distance, they could see lights beginning to come on in the houses of neighbors who had no idea that the woman they had dismissed as just the help was actually the lady of the largest estate in the area. "What happens now?" Maria asked. Richard smiled, the first truly relaxed expression she had seen on his face since his return. "Now we live," he said simply. "We travel when we want to. We stay home when we want to. We hire people to help with the house, and we treat them the way human beings deserve to be treated. We remember what it feels like to have power and use it to lift people up instead of tearing them down." The next morning, Maria woke up in the master bedroom, in the bed that had been made for her every day by hands that were never allowed to rest in its comfort. Sunlight streamed through windows that she had cleaned without ever being able to enjoy the view they provided. But now the view was hers, and the sunlight was warming her face as she planned a day that belonged to her completely. She found Richard in the kitchen, making coffee with the same machine that Carmen had operated every morning before being dismissed along with the rest of the hostel staff. He had already contacted an employment agency about hiring people to help with the house, but his instructions had been specific. They wanted employees, not servants. They wanted people who would be treated with respect, paid fairly, and given the dignity that every worker deserved. "I've been thinking about the others," Richard said as he handed her a cup of coffee in a mug that she had washed hundreds of times but never been allowed to use. "Carmen, Roberto, Sarah. They weren't part of the problem. They were just trying to survive in a hostile environment." Maria nodded. "Carmen was always kind to me when Mrs. Madison wasn't watching. Roberto would leave flowers by the kitchen door sometimes, little gestures to brighten my day. Sarah was learning to keep her head down, but she never joined in the cruelty." "I'd like to offer them their jobs back," Richard said, "with better pay, better hours, and the understanding that this house operates on respect, not fear." Over the following weeks, the Madison estate was transformed in ways that went far beyond ownership documents and legal papers. Carmen returned to a kitchen where she was encouraged to cook meals that people would actually eat and enjoy, where her culinary skills were appreciated rather than taken for granted. Roberto continued tending gardens that now bloomed for people who noticed their beauty, who thanked him for his artistry with growing things. Sarah learned what it felt like to work for employers who saw her as a person rather than a function. But the most significant change was in Maria herself. The woman who had absorbed years of humiliation and disrespect began to rediscover the strength and dignity that had been hidden beneath layers of survival strategy. She walked through her home with her head high, made decisions about its operation with confidence, and slowly began to heal from the wounds that had been inflicted by people who had mistaken cruelty for authority. The neighborhood took time to adjust to the revelation. Some of the other wealthy families were embarrassed by their own treatment of Maria during her years as the help. Others were curious about the love story that had been hidden in plain sight. But Maria found that she cared less about their opinions than she had expected. When you've survived being invisible, being seen clearly by the people who matter most is more than enough. Richard often remarked that the business troubles that had kept them apart, while painful, had taught them both something valuable about the difference between having power and abusing it. Maria had learned what it felt like to be powerless, which made her more conscious of how she treated others now that she had authority. Richard had learned that love meant more than providing financial security. It meant ensuring that the person you love is treated with dignity even when you're not there to protect them. Sometimes, in the evening, they would stand in the living room where Maria had been humiliated for sitting on the sofa. The same white leather cushions were there, the same expensive fabric and perfect positioning. But now Maria would sit wherever she pleased, reading books from the library that had previously been off-limits, drinking wine from crystal glasses that she had polished but never been allowed to use. And sometimes Richard would find her there and remember the moment when he had walked into that room and seen the truth of how his wife had been treated. The memory still made him angry, but it also reminded him of why love requires more than just feeling. It requires action, protection, and the courage to use whatever power you have to defend the people who matter most. Silent ranks often unfold in spaces where power and vulnerability intersect, where assumptions about worth and value are challenged by the simple truth that dignity belongs to everyone. Maria's story reminds us that sometimes the people we overlook, dismiss, or mistreat carry secrets that could change everything. Sometimes the maid is the wife. Sometimes the servant is the owner. Sometimes the person you think has no power holds the key to your entire world. What matters isn't whether we can predict these reversals, but whether we treat every person with the respect they deserve regardless of what we think we know about their circumstances. Because in the end, the measure of our character isn't how we treat people who can help us, but how we treat people who we think can't hurt us. This story was brought to you by Heroes Unheard. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how you remember them. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.